Doing today? Welcome to Throughline. My name is Alexander Squire. I will be moderating this little discussion today, but thanks again for coming. This is our 5th show here at Throughline, and we are lucky to have with us both of the featured artists, Luisa Duarte and Jonas Crisco. Just a little bit of background about both of them. Jonas is one of our founding members here. He's a native of Austin, a longtime artist who also founded the Icosa Gallery there, and we're very happy to have him and his organizational experience and skill here. Luisa is a wonderful artist I've known for many years here in Houston. She comes to us by way originally of Venezuela and has a great background in architecture as well. So we're going to get into some of that will come out, I'm sure, in the conversation today. Okay, so a little bit about the show, I guess just my initial reactions to it. It's just almost like a match made in heaven, kind of, to me. Like, you guys have a very interestingly similar and disparate style at the same time. They're both printmakers, so both come from a similar background of technique and graphic sort of imagery and composition. But obviously you can see that there are subtle differences between the presentation and the sort of final product that they both arrive at. So talking a little bit about that, talking a little bit about the process that you guys go through. What I noticed, something you both achieve, is an embracing of a graphic quality in your work, hard edges, sort of symbols, uses of that kind of language. But you also both sort of undermine that hard edge graphic quality that we, or at least I, associate with a lot of printmaking. And you do that in different ways. So Jonas, your work particularly, I notice and really love the use of collage. So the tearing of the paper, those soft natural edges, also the natural quality of the wood that you employ as a support, and how that again sort of like contrasts like what you would think of as being super clean and super graphic. Also, you know, sampling recycled graphic print material from the world and then reassembling that. So can you give some insight into your process? And it seems you both make multiples and destroy them as fragments to then reassemble, but then maybe also start with building the surface and then print over top.
Yeah, I'm an instructor as well, and I always tell my students, find how you make and then set yourself up. And so the way in which I make is I collect a lot of different things, be it material, literal material like old fence pickets, 2x4s from houses that have been demolished that are like 70-year-old 2x4s. Also imagery as well, making my own imagery and also collecting imagery. Like, for example, these little print slips that are on the side of most boxes that you see. I collected a lot of those, and then also making my own, the arrows or the flags, and then also the little kind of squiggly. And so it usually starts out with printing a lot of material. I used to be a production printer, and so while I was doing production printing, I was also had a residency at the High Point Print Center in Minneapolis. And so it was this juxtaposition from in the afternoon, I'd be printing thousands of things that were, just going to be kind of tossed or worn, etc. And then going into the residency at night and working with some very fine art type pieces, but using the same process in terms of silkscreen. And so this kind of gave me the idea of just kind of collecting and using scraps. At High Point, I used a lot of the tear-offs, from the prints, because it was great paper and it was just going in the trash. And I was like, well, hey. And so then I started to kind of create these quilts, very much into quilting. And so with the objects that you see here, and you can see I call them objects, it's really about using, the uniqueness of print, because you have the multiples to really kind of index things. And so once you have things that you have 20 of the same thing, what you can do is you can build these surfaces that kind of go in and out, almost as visual texture. And also, accentuating that through them being objects, right? Being these, I had a past print professor who used to say that either a painting is a window on the world or an object of the world. And I've always seen it as these chunks of the world. And so, I have a background in contracting, and so I use a lot of those materials to kind of accentuate it and also to kind of create a patina, kind of this nostalgic wear to it. as if something's been kind of hidden in a barn somewhere for years. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely get a sense of the worn or the wear and tear or the old in your work. So the background in production printing, I mean, I also nerd out a little bit over registration marks and CMYK swatches. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can observe this particular work later closely and you'll see what I'm referring to. But how improvisational are you then? I mean, you collect the work, are you sort of playing when you start a work?
Most
or do you have a
definitely.
plan going?
Most definitely. I'm a big fan of jazz, and that's the thing. If you look at jazz music, right, you'll have a composition that like starts it off, and then it grows from that. And so what I'll do is I'll set myself up. I'll have a bunch of prints, like I have a big box of just prints, and then I have a bunch of lumber and just a bunch of things that I collect, right, in all my bins. And if any of y'all want to come and visit my studio, I have a studio over at Mother Dog, and it's I got it all set up. And then it's time to make. And so I usually work on about 10 to 15 different pieces at once. And some of those within the 10 to 15 are different series. I'm very much into working in series. You can kind of see here with arrows and then with flags, and doing about 4 or 5 within each of it and having a dialogue within that. But again, having myself set up and then kind of starting that conversation. Like with a piece like this, so I was working on this for about 2 years, on and off, until it finally felt done. Right? And so it is improvisation. It's very similar to abstract expressionist painting. You're kind of going back and forth and finding that balance. More straightforward compositions like the arrows were, more straightforward and really kind of playing with direction and line. And, again, like the title of the show, where the lines meet, that area that theoretically never exists. But, using these very, simple symbols, but yet that are very, very much loaded in our daily lives. I mean, you look on the highways, you look at, borders, etc. So it is very improvisational.
Yeah, I mean, it's akin sort of to Luis's practice of monoprinting in terms of variations on a theme in a way, and it's just exploring the possibilities that a screen or a pile of paper can give you. There's always more to do.
Yeah, and I like that kind of that takeoff because, with printmaking, it's very much about planning. It's about the process. You're starting right here, you're starting in layers, and this layer has to meet up with this layer. And I like kind of negating that through taking it, and once I've done all these layers, just taking it and ripping it. And it's the thing about, if you have something on good paper.
We love that.
If you have something on good paper, it's amazing. It's amazing the line that you get if you rip it this way versus if you rip it this way. And then also when you put it, you collage it on, and then you start to sand into it and use that pigment as, true pigment, right? Because you're sanding it, you're left with this pigment, and then rubbing it back into the paper. This back and forth, I mean, this is it's a very physical process. Like, I'm using my hands and, really kind of sculpting these things.
I think that's where, for me, you've taken it to a new level that I really enjoy because, yes, there's the graphic, things that we can latch on to, the line, the sensibility. But then again, just the way that you break that up through the physical, as you put it, decisions and qualities, the choices in material, the way that you face the paper, the coatings, and again, those lines that are breaking up your symbols and images in a subtle but natural kind of way. Which takes me to Luisa. So I think the work is characterized by a lot of hard shapes, the hard-edged forms, which to me have a lot of, because of that hardness and the way they're floating against this pristine white background, they have a lot of presence and a lot of weight, kind of a quiet heaviness to them, a quiet resonance, which I really enjoy about your work. And then the way that you, for me, kind of break up that, again, just to use the word graphic sensibility, that cleanness, is through the use of texture and color. And that seems to be your source of joy in terms of the experimentation. Is that right?
Yeah, but it comes from my practice as an architect, the love for the paper, the use of the paper, and frankly, the use of the shape, the square, the trapezoid, which is a very dynamic figure that can translate or make a bridge from architecture to my art. And I love the way I can modify it and create these monotypes with that constant shape. And that is the part that is planned on my work. And I prepare the surfaces, I prepare the templates, everything organized, because sometimes I need that rigor of the structure. But then when I apply the inks and several layers of inks on the material that I choose that is not a typical material, it's not the plexi that is used to be used for the monotypes. And when I use different types of pressure, that's when the improvisational aspect comes to flow.
Yeah.
And then all these shapes has a connection to find a language that connects my story here in United States with my story back in Venezuela, like finding a language, a continuation of what I did there and what I do here. I didn't want to become like steps, this is close. No, it's a continuation. It has been a research in those images that now I incorporate the colors. Before, I don't know if you remember, I did a lot of prints with very flat, tropical, intense colors. Now I'm mixing the monotypes, which were monochromatic, and I'm adding the color to enhance them and to give them another way of continue.
I remember the colorful sort of screen prints and digital prints that you were doing a few years back, and yeah, I mean, those felt so much more arty to me, like really architectural, and
Very graphic.
Yeah, and almost poppy in a way.
Yeah.
Just to touch on something you said, and I'm kind of curious. So, like in relating this back to your experience as an architect, are you generating these forms from that mindset, like a designer, or are you referencing, or is it coming from something?
You know, when I do my work, I don't think about what am I going to do. I just follow my need to create, and then after I finish or while I'm in the process, it's when I realize, oh my God, I've been working with these shapes for a long time. Where do they come from? What's the genesis of that? And it's architecture. And I thought a long time ago that I was either being an architect or an artist, that it couldn't be mixed. And it's when I come here to United States that I realized that I can wear all those hats and merge them. And what I'm doing here is merging the monotype, the monochromatic, with the colors, with the history of architecture, and adding the threads and pins, which is another layer.
So, just for anybody who's not quite clear on how these are made, because you've gone so many steps that in some cases it would be hard to tell that this was like a mono. You know, I come to expect like an embossed like shape in paper, which you do have like in the front gallery, for example. But then you have these, more three-dimensional compositions. Your plates, because you mentioned they're not plexiglass, they're not copper, right? So you're using cut pieces of mat board, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So simple and effective, inexpensive plate material.
And practical, because I can do them in my studio. I can have a cutting knife, create the shape, and then apply the layers of paint. And do the prints at the studio, because not always I have the possibility of using a press, and I have my Baron, my glass Baron that works very well, and I bought recently portable. Thank you, a portable press, and that gives the different pressure when I print. It's not like an intense, continuous friction that is needed to get a very dark embossed image. And I love that. I have learned that I have decided to take the best of what I get at the moment, in not only in my art, but in life as well. And it's a good way of living.
Yeah.
Loving
I would agree.
what you get, I mean.
I think Luisa brings up a really good point of the way I think our process is very similar of there is some planning, but it's really letting the process kind of, going along with it.
Yeah.
Again, like, very similar to jazz, like, you have that song, John Coltrane's, all the beautiful things, you got it. But then there's so much into it that it turns and it morphs into something else.
It's really interesting to hear you guys talk about that. I mean, for me, I vacillate. I'm never just one thing, which is part of my problem, I think. But so I go between improvising and like meticulously planning things out. But I do think that is like that there is at some point in the process of printmaking, like there is a point where you have to kind of let go, and it's going to be what it's going to be, especially when you're doing monoprinting through press. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the color choices. I know you're leaving it up to chance a little bit, and that seems to be part of the fun for you with this. But to me, they definitely kind of create. There's a contrast, right, between that organic quality that you're getting from the different pressure from the hand rubbing or the whatever that's transferring onto the page, and then those hard lines, right? So obviously, I think you enjoy that idea of like texture contrasted with hard edges and cleanliness, and again, the presentation, they're floating off of this black or this white perfect background. So that texture is really singing. It's like the focus for me, anyway, the form and the texture in contrast to each other. So, I don't know, for me, it kind of creates a little bit of a tension. Is that something that you think about and that's important to you?
No, not really. For me, it's I see more the shape. And when I finish the process of printing the paper and I cut it or selected the shape that I want to do, I find the pleasure of floating it, taking it off the paper like it's getting ready to fly away, to get off the surface, and then I create these. I call them territories, the limits with the pins and thread. And sometimes they are very fragile, but they are present. And it's important for me, the conversation about how those subtly placed limits should be respected. And they become part of another virtual reality floating on top that is activated by light, and those things fascinate me.
It's interesting you said territories, because actually one of the things I kind of always thought about, like I knew there was the architectural influence and background, but also, again, these shapes, the texture, to me has always made me think of landscape, actually, and the way in which people carve up land with these sort of arbitrary borders, political borders, private landowner. If you look at like a map of the farms in Texas or something like that, right? So it has that kind of. It definitely reminds me of landscape. Let's see. We've already answered so many of my questions. Yeah. You answered them all. Let's move on. Jonas. Let's talk about the content a little bit of the work. And you touched on it briefly, but there's recognizable recurring shapes throughout the work. We talked about sort of where you're coming from with that. Can you tell us a little bit about like what attracts you to these specific symbols? Is it the fact that they're like common signage in a way, or?
Yeah, very much so. I would say definitely with the arrows. I mean, the arrows is such, in terms of semiotics, is such a loaded image. Very simple, right? It gives direction. It also delineates depending on if it's red or black. Delineates if you're in the red or if you're in the black. Up, down. And also just kind of like within playing with them, because I've done a pretty good series. I've probably done about 8 pieces with arrows. But when you're putting them together, again, it's just this direction too. And how they kind of, if an arrow is up, what it communicates versus an arrow being down, versus when they come together, and just that pattern that it kind of creates.
So again, like kind of exploring the possibilities, like.
Yeah, and then also when you take a
Mm-hmm.
composition and you divide it into a diptych,
Yeah.
and then when you bring a piece together and you have a big line going through the middle, and it's where.
Do you get ideas in the middle of it? Like if you're doing that one and you twist an arrow this way? Are you like halfway through a piece and go,
Oh,
oh,
yeah,
crap, I
yeah.
gotta make another one now?
Well,
The
actually,
happy accident.
Like, I gotta try that.
I have a whole, like, I mean, I was in my studio and I took pictures of each, like, way in which each one is turned around.
Okay, so you
And so I was just like, okay. And, you know, even with ideas of like, you know, I could, you know, make, you know, 4 pieces that each one has a different direction. Kind of sort of, if you go to, you know, Austin Ellsworth Kelly's Austin, you know, you go in there and he plays around with different compositions, you know, in that way. And it is something of like, you know, when you start working with semiotics, you know, when you start working with these arrows, because again, it's a very loaded, you know, thing, you know, once you guys leave here, notice how many arrows that are around you all day, and you're like, oh.
Well, so that's one example, and that is like a very ubiquitous, kind of forceful symbol, but you've got some others that are a little bit lighter, we'll say. So like the flags, for example, and the honeycomb shape that I see recurring. Are
Yeah.
those self-generated, or are those taken from something?
Those are self-generated. You know, the flags are something that I've always just kind of been, you know, drawn to. You know, you see them in car lots, you see them at festivals, you see them at political rallies, and of just this thing of all these flags that are up and just the different colors that you see. You know, the banners of countries, etc. And so it's something that I've always been, you know, drawn to as an image. And so it's something that, again, you know, I made a bunch of prints and kind of played with back and forth. And I've done a couple compositions with that. The kind of cube piece back there, it's a baby block pattern, which actually you can see in like older quilt making, and as well as in a lot. I was fortunate enough to study in Italy for a summer in college, and you see it in a lot of the floors of cathedrals.
The tiles.
And so you'll see it within this piece, and it's basically the same print. And so I had it, I created an Illustrator, and I printed a number of these prints, and so then collaged it together with this. And I've done a couple of pieces with that pattern, with the baby block pattern. That one that was up there was one that I had just put on a panel, and I never felt like I needed to touch it to go into it. And so, yeah, it just survived. You know,
Yeah,
that's
that
what
was
it
felt
was.
good as it was, yeah.
But you know, you see a piece like this where this whole thing was plastered with them, and then I went over and, you know, collaged into it. These are all cut out of old Lone Star boxes, and you know, started to play with that. I also have a composition that I created that I did a whole spectrum. You know, at Home Depot you can find those color palettes with a little.
Swatches, yeah.
They're archival. And so I went and I just took it. I just got myself a nice rainbow, and I created this beautiful spectrum. It was a piece about this big. And just cut them all out individually. And so that's the other thing about printmaking, right? And so once you have that print, the baby block, that is a template, and all you do is you're just using that to cut that geometric, you know, that little diamond,
Yeah.
and fitting it together. And so I had one where it was like the whole thing was a big spectrum, called a unicorn. I thought it was really nice.
You mentioned quilting earlier, and I think that that describes your physical process kind of nicely.
I'm a big fan of quilting. The B-bin quilts, G-bin quilts in Alabama are just fantastic. I just like this idea of using discarded materials and like collecting them and putting them into a larger composition. You know, it's very similar to like how we, you know, experience reality really these days. You're on your phone, you're listening to something, you're watching TV, you're maybe listening to somebody talking to you. You know, all these different things. And so with a composition like this that's very loaded, it's really kind of like playing with that. Whereas these are a little bit, you know, the arrows are a little bit more quiet. But in previous works, I was interested in this idea of kind of overloading, you know, kind of creating this visual texture to a certain degree, which I think printmaking lends itself to, because you're able to make multiples.
And to layer endlessly.
Layer, tons of collage material. And so rather than going and trying to find it, I was like, well, why don't I just make it? There's a great artist, Lance Lesher, and he finds a lot of like books and stuff and creates it. And I remember, you know, visiting his studio when I was undergrad at UT, and I was always like, you know, he was always talking about how he's always had to collect the books and this and that, and how he needs to tear the books up and this and that. I was just kind of like, well, why don't you just make your own? Like, you know, take it, make some screens, you know, and then you have that nice high quality ink, you know, be able to run through. So, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think for me, in a nutshell, it's sort of like you're sampling from your environment, from life, like symbols that are ubiquitous, things that you've noticed that you were drawn to. They're also kind of symbolic in their own way. And then rather than layering endlessly, although this would imply that you do that,
This one
sort of remixing almost those elements in different ways. And then for me, kind of leaving it with the patina of almost nostalgia in a way.
Yeah, and then really, if you look at all the work, there's not a sharp edge on it. Like I did this whole series, years ago, but it was about taking the artist's hand out. It was as if a machine had made it. And I ended up, after grad school, doing this residency down in South Carolina, and I completely changed. I really wanted to bring the hand back in. And so if you look at these, all these edges have been sanded down. And I just like this idea of like not having a hard edge, and it's just this softness of it, right?
I think in that's interesting to consider in the context of the digital age as well, and the way that we see him. Like, I've looked at my own screen prints on my website, and I go, God, that looks digital. Like, it's too clean almost. Do you think about that at all? Like, about how the work exists in that context?
Yeah, we live in a clean world. That's the thing that's kind of
Or
funny.
better question is that, do you think that maybe was like an impetus for that switch that you talked about?
I think so. I think it's like bringing the artist's hand back. And again, where I was in South Carolina, you have things, the material that is just like been out. You have kudzu that's overgrowing stuff. And even like coming back to Texas, there's a certain way that the weather and the environment that we're here in, that it treats materials. It's like the 2x4s on that. Now these were from houses in Austin that were built in the 40s that were being demolished. And I would go and pick out the 2x4s. You're talking like a 70-year-old 2x4. And some of the stuff, the trees don't really exist anymore, like the Georgia pine, real true Georgia pine. And so it's just interesting to use that material and bringing it in. And it gives kind of this, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Walter Benjamin, who wrote this essay called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and talking about bringing the artist's hand back into it. But I also think that is in touch with material too. I think there's something about a 70-year-old 2x4, you can't reproduce that. It's just like, and then I just think it brings an element, it's almost using material as mark. And I think you can see it in that piece back there between the cube and the wind one. And then also this, again, using these materials, one is material, but two is mark as well.
One thing I would like to add, that it's always a reference that the machine is the one that does precise lines, not necessarily.
Yeah.
There's no machine in here.
You are the machine.
I am the machine. So the hand of the artist it has different perceptions, because I can create this I'm interested in creating this hard line because I know how difficult it is to do it by hand and to have that precise line. And so I'm always trying to create those definite shapes or areas. And like in contrast with you, which was what interested us to create this show, we both work in printmaking and so differently, and the results are so different, but they bring a conversation of all the possibilities that we can do in printmaking.
And I think that's what's kind of interesting about, just kind of this, how we organize ourselves here at Throughline. It's like, we have artists that are going to be shown that have disparate, and diverse practices, but the shows, sometimes, the ones that are the most disparate work together because it, has that juxtaposition.
Right.
And, again, whereas mine's very, like I've sanded down all the edges, you've sharpened all the edges.
I'd say it's a feminine, masculine show.
I know it is, which is funny because mine,
I would argue your work feels maybe a little more masculine. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting thing. When we were talking about it,
Well, we all have a little bit of both.
we were talking about how they, my pieces all, are just very heavy. They come off the wall. And Luisa's they're contained and very light. And then we looked at each other and I'm like, yeah, I'm 6'3", 200 pounds. It's just like, and I think that's the thing. It's just, like I tell my students, it's like, it's not about style, it's voice. And like, find your voice. Like, what is your voice? And I think that's what's really interesting because I think we both, you walk in here and you're like, oh, okay, wow, there's no, like you got two
An integration.
artists having a conversation with their voices.
Well, yeah, so I'll skip ahead to it, but one of my questions for both of you was actually sort of, what was the initial, because we all, if you're not familiar with our concept, there's 20 artists, and we're all going to show in pairs of 2, right, and we kind of paired up. So can you explain a little bit about, like, what initially drew you to each other's work?
I want to tell an anecdote. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Venezuela, so I'm not familiar with the prom concept.
The prom concept?
And then we were at a celebration, and the group was considering the invitation to the other partner as a prom invitation. And then Jonah said to me, I'm inviting you, he said, let's do the show together. And I didn't understand, and then he said, I'm inviting you to the prom, and I was left.
I thought we could, come together and help kind of, continue that dialogue I just had about it.
That actually leads me into my final section of questions, which is sort of about dimensionality. And a nail on the head, like both of you employ interesting ways to expand the possibilities within printmaking that break the expectations that you just outlined, right? So matted, framed, flat, embossed, like classic beautiful prints, etchings, Degas in the museum, whatever, right? That's kind of like what we think of with this. When you do this in different ways, you kind of talked already about like the significance behind the wood and the softening of the edges, the worn, the sort of nostalgic narrative, and the use of history. Luisa, so we talked about masculine and feminine, but that aside, like the difference to me, like you're doing these sort of protrusions, right? Your work to me is like it wants to come into the space. Kind of like old signage would be these like large boxes with lights inside, right? That's what I kind of get from your work. It's presenting itself in that way. Luisa, I think is interesting because your work is doing both at the same time. Like you've constructed these recesses, which almost feel like I'm looking through some kind of viewport or an aerial kind of view of, again, to me, like I keep going to landscape with it, but you've created a different sort of recess and then coming back out again in the form of the prints that have been topped off the paper and also these little pins that you're using. Can you talk about those pins and thread a little bit more? Like you mentioned creating boundaries. So what does that mean to you, creating boundaries, in the context of reacting to your own monochromes, basically?
Well, I always had a fascination when I saw images of new discoveries, ancient discoveries, and how they mark the areas with pins, with stakes and lines, and tracing the grid where everything was. So I guess that comes for me as unconsciously or my subconscious to determine that I am here, that I have come to this place, that I am not like you, that you bring stuff from existent places. I am creating places, creating territories that could be, in cases, like a portal for looking through, leaving the white space, the negative space as an indication that you have to focus on the object, or like windows to another layer, another reality. And the pins and threads give me then another layer of information, because you can see them by themselves, but also with the interaction of the light, it creates another line that doesn't exist, that is not there. And I like that subtlety. I like not to be frontal, to insinuate that there's something that is happening there, that you have to come close and interact with the piece. And in the case of these works, the size is very circumstantial. Because I recently moved to my studio, and I was sharing with Sarah Sudov, and then we moved from one small space to another one, and it was always in fluxes, always happening something, moving here, moving there. And for me, I said, well, I need to work. I need to work in this tiny space, and I have decided that to use all the prints, all the works that I have, instead of buying more paper, which is very tempting.
I have so much paper if you...
Oh, well, we can talk. But to use them and to give them another life with color, with threads, with small spaces that are manageable for me right now.
Sure.
And but I would love to do this in huge sizes.
I could see that.
If you have any information of a big press, let me know.
I do have a large etching press sitting in the hallway of Box 13.
Well,
Yeah. We'll talk.
that's a very nice invitation.
Well, so back to the pins and threads, because I think one thing that when you were talking, I also kind of noticed. I mean, you mentioned the idea of a window or a portal, and the focus, right? But I think another beautiful thing about it is the way that it interrupts, like, the expected order, in terms of perspective and depth perception, right? When I look, because those shadows that you create, like the wire is on top,
Yeah.
but then the shadows are underneath everything. So that's an interesting, you're really playing with perception there. And I'm seeing multiple things at once, which is
Well, you know,
interesting.
also the layering, when you start a project in architecture, you start in different scales. And at least when I study, I was studying doing my hand drawings and playing with translucent papers, and starting with a small scale, and then you put a paper on top and trace again and create this layering that later became part of AutoCAD and those, sorry, AutoCAD is what, computer aided design. So I guess I cannot separate myself and my practice as an artist from the practice as an architect.
And you shouldn't.
Thank you.
Do you save all of your plates?
I do.
Yeah. So you have a ton
I
of
do.
these.
And you know what I did lately is because the plates gets another color different than the prints. It has a story of the traces, the lines, and I frame them because they are beautiful objects.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And do you save all of your screens?
No. I've got like 20 screens that have images on it in my studio. Yeah, I mean, I'll save my positives. I don't know if you're all familiar with silk screen, but you'll have a positive and then you can always just put it on the screen.
Transparency film.
Yeah, and so I'll keep that, but I mean,
I do that as well, but I had the pleasure of visiting Mike Perry's studio once, and he had like 400 screens.
Oh,
He was like,
wow.
I never get rid of a screen after I make it because I come back to it and use it years later.
Like
but-
Rauschenberg had like 10,000 screens, and he had like this categorizing the thing, and he would just go into this catalog and go get me A24, and they'd run down in the basement.
We'll get there one day.
I've always, honestly, when I've ever used my screen, I always just reclaim it.
Yeah,
You know,
me too. Yeah.
and have it. But yeah, I have a bunch of stuff just left over from working in a shop, and then having all of that stuff available to me. And I've always used it, like in Austin, to start a spray printing cooperative. And so I brought it in and helped start a spray printing cooperative, helped start a screen printing program at the Contemporary. And so really, that's another part of my process, I guess you could say, as an artist, is kind of being a community facilitator. Like, I've always been drawn to silk screen. I think it's one thing that's, you don't really need a lot to do it, and you can do a lot with it.
It's
And
true.
and it can really kind of mimic any other market, any other printmaking process, other than Bossman, but there's ways to get it.
There is a really nice community energy that you get when you're in a print shop working with a bunch of people.
Yes.
Everybody's sort of,
Yeah.
it's like a hum to the whole thing.
And I think you've got, like with ceramics, it's sort of the same thing, because you're using, communal tools together.
Mhm.
And there is something that is like, you're seeing something somebody else is doing, vice versa. There's this energy. Whereas, like, I went to school for painting in a painter's studio.
Painters would know.
You're there alone, you're listening to Moonlight Sonata, you're wondering, shall I cut my ear off today? Is today?
Just the day to day.
No, I kid, but no, I like that community factor of printmaking. That's one of the things that I really enjoy, because it is communal.
Well, thank you both. I guess at this point, we'll open up to any questions from anybody here. Anybody has any burning questions? Yes, Heather.
Have you all talked about the kitchen space?
Oh, no, we
Oh,
haven't.
no, we haven't. Thank you. The kitchen space.
So Lisa just installed a piece in the kitchen that everybody should go look at because, we were talking about these, the employers of thread nails and these very small, very quiet, delicate pieces here. But, there's an installation in the back that transforms the space, on a scale. And so,
Yeah.
Or that's how I receive it, because it starts in one place and ends in another. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little.
Well, in these cases, when I do this kind of installation, I translate it's a scale. If you translate that thin line on that board to the wall, the line has to be thicker and the pins have to be bigger, and that's what I try to do. And when I do these installations, I let myself be more free in the sense of I have a pre-concept, but then it's a communion with the moment and the wall and the movement of doing things. And I like to see them as trajectories that can be start from each side. I always start from the right to the left, opposite to how we read. And it's funny, I didn't think about it. But it's very free. It's very free, very spontaneous. I think more those than that. But I let the fluid energy, creative energy guide me.
So do you start the process with a preconceived idea of what you're going to do, or do you go in there and you just go to town?
Kind of both. I had that trapezoid, the shape, and I like how it interacts with the wall and creates like a glow around it. And I decided to use it and say, okay, how can I incorporate that with the lines? And I just wrap it. I didn't know, but I decided that at the moment of doing the installation. And then I was looking for other pieces that I did a long time ago, and I found this culture of little ladders that were a constant theme when I started painting. The ladders signify for me like going up, growing, finding a way to find what I wanted. And I found them, and I said, well, they are perfect color. They go here, they connect the space with the lines, and I think it works. And I invite you all to take a peek.
I want to see you do a huge wall, because that's the thing that's kind of fun about it, is that it does take you on a journey, and it's really, if you were given the opportunity to do like some of these long hallways, and that's the thing that's really kind of nice about one from a practical point of view. You're talking about string and pins, so you're not material costs and all that much. But also just you're kind of taking that journey. You're taking that Paul Klee quote, taking a line for a walk. I always like that.
Yeah.
And it's a literal translation. You're really kind of walking.
I did a big one in Austin at the library.
Oh really?
Uh-huh.
What year?
Before the pandemic. Now everything is before and after the pandemic. I think it was 2018, perhaps, 17.
Oh.
And the brand.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, it's not.
We could have met each other even earlier.
I do.